You don't smell like a healer. I wasn't always.
The rain battered the reinforced glass of Dr. Eris Thorne's office, a relentless gray rhythm that seemed to mock the silence inside the room. It was a cold, sterilized silence, the kind that usually follows the announcement of a death. But nobody had died today. You broke the seal on a crash cart that wasn't assigned to your station. You intubated a pediatric patient without waiting for the respiratory therapist. He paused, letting the accusations hang in the air like smoke. You are a liability. Sarah stood perfectly still, her feet planted shoulder-width apart, her hands clasped behind her back in the small of her spine. It was a posture she hadn't learned in nursing school. Nursing school taught you to hunch, to make yourself smaller, to look non-threatening. This posture was drilled into her bones years ago, on scorching parade decks and in the backs of vibrating transport planes, in a life she had tried very hard to forget. She could hear the hum of the HVAC system, the distant chime of an elevator, the squeak of a cartwheel in the hallway. Her senses were dialed up to 11, a byproduct of adrenaline she hadn't fully processed yet. "The patient was cyanotic, doctor," she said, her voice low, devoid of the tremble most nurses had when facing the chief of medicine. She spoke with the flat effect of someone reporting a situation report over a radio. His oxygen saturation was under 60 and dropping. He was exhibiting tracheal tugging. If I had waited for the respiratory therapist, who was, I might add, on a break in the cafeteria, you would be explaining a brain-dead child to a mother right now. Instead, you're firing me. Thorne's jaw tightened. A small muscle feathered beneath his left ear. He hated her calmness. He hated that she didn't cry, didn't beg, didn't offer excuses about stress or confusion. Most of all, he hated that she was right. But being right was irrelevant if you were insubordinate. He picked up his gold-plated pen. He held it like a weapon, testing the weight. He signed the termination order with a flourish that felt like a violent act, the scratch of the nib against the paper loud in the silent room. "Your arrogance is dangerous, Ms. Miller. This hospital is a machine. It functions on gears and cogs turning in unison. You are a broken cog. You grind against the mechanism." He capped the pen with a decisive click. "Hand over your badge. Security will escort you out." Sarah looked at the man. Really looked at him. She saw the soft hands that hadn't touched a patient in a decade, the manicured fingernails, the fear behind his eyes. It wasn't fear of death. He saw that on charts every day. It was fear of lawsuits, fear of insurance boards, fear of losing his reserved parking spot. He was a man who thought power came from titles. She slowly reached up to her collar. Her fingers brushed the hard plastic of her ID card. Sarah Miller, RN. It was a flimsy piece of plastic, but it had been her shield. It was the costume she wore to pretend she was normal. She unclipped the badge. She held it for a second, feeling the weight of the last 2 years evaporating. Then she placed it gently on the desk. It clicked against the wood, a sound of finality. "It's Sarah," she said softly. "Not Ms. Miller." "And doctor, a machine doesn't care if a heart stops. A nurse does." She turned on her heel, a precise military pivot. The rubber soles of her sneakers squeaked slightly on the linoleum as she walked to the door. She grasped the cold metal handle, paused for a heartbeat, and walked out. She didn't look back at the man who thought he held the power of God in a ballpoint pen. The walk to the exit was a gauntlet of shame. The hospital corridor, usually a place of purpose and kinetic energy, felt like a tunnel closing in on her. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed with a headache-inducing frequency, flickering slightly near the nurse's station. She passed the central desk. In fact, a 4-year-old boy was currently breathing in the ICU solely because Nurse Sarah Miller had decided that a heartbeat was more important than a signature. Dr. Thorne, the chief of medicine at St. Jude's Metropolitan, did not see it that way. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a fortress of bureaucracy, sliding a single sheet of paper across the polished surface. 2 colleagues, women she had shared coffees and double shifts with, suddenly found the pattern of the floor tiles incredibly interesting. Jessica, who Sarah had covered for when her kid was sick, was aggressively typing on a keyboard that wasn't even plugged in. They knew. News traveled faster than a virus in St. Jude's. Sarah was the pariah now. The rogue. The one who thought she knew better than the handbook. Did she really think she was some kind of hero? A whisper floated from an open linen closet, sharp and venomous. It was Brenda, the charge nurse, who cared more about lunch breaks than patient care. "Just wants attention," another voice murmured, barely audible over the beep of a distant heart monitor. Thorne was right. She's too intense. It scares the patients. Have you seen the way she looks at trauma cases like she's hungry for it? Sarah kept her eyes forward, staring at the exit sign glowing red at the end of the hall. Too intense. That's what they called it here. That hyper-focus, that ability to shut down the emotional centers of the brain and operate purely on mechanics and biology. In the sandbox, thousands of miles away, amidst the dust and the burning trash and the smell of cordite, they didn't call it intensity. They called it competence. They called it keeping your brothers alive. They called it the ghost. But here, amidst the billing codes and liability waivers, survival instincts were just personality defects. She pushed through the double doors of the emergency exit. The hydraulic hiss of the closing doors sounded like a seal breaking. The world assaulted her senses. The humidity hit her like a physical blow, a wet, heavy blanket that smelled of ozone and wet asphalt. The rain was coming down in sheets now, a torrential downpour washing the grime of the city into the overflowing gutters. Sarah walked into the staff parking lot, clutching her worn canvas messenger bag against her chest to shield it from the downpour. She stopped at the edge of the curb. She didn't run to her car. She just stood there, letting the rain soak into her scrubs. The water turned the light blue fabric dark navy, plastering it to her skin. It was cold, shocking, and incredibly real. She felt lighter, strangely, lighter. The heavy cloak of hospital politics, of fake smiles and whispered betrayals, was washing away, replaced by the honest, biting cold of the storm. She reached into her bag, her fingers fumbling past her stethoscope, now a useless snake of rubber and steel, past the half-eaten granola bar that had been her lunch, until they touched cold metal. She pulled it out. It wasn't a phone. It was a set of dog tags on a broken chain, the metal scratched and dented, dull in the gray light. Miller S. Combat Medic 75th Ranger Regiment Support. She stared at the metal, watching the rain beat on the surface, distorting the stamped letters. She had buried that woman. She had tried to be Sarah the nurse, the quiet one, the one who followed orders and wore pastel scrubs. But the ghost was always there, lurking in the reflection of the windows at night, waiting in the silence between heartbeats. And now, the ghost was unemployed. Sarah took a deep breath, tasting the rain and the exhaust fumes of the city. She was about to step toward her rusted sedan, ready to go home and stare at a wall for 6 hours, when the atmosphere shifted. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a vibration. The puddles in the parking lot began to ripple. Tiny concentric circles vibrated outward from the center of the oily water, like something massive was approaching. The chain-link fence surrounding the generator enclosure rattled against its posts, a metallic chatter that grew louder by the second. Then came the noise. The sound of the paper friction against the wood was like a hiss. Thorne didn't look at her. He looked at the smudge of betadine on her scrub top, his nose wrinkling in distaste. To him, the stain wasn't a badge of hard work. It was a sign of disorder. And in Thorne's hospital, disorder was a sin far greater than malpractice. The rain battered the reinforced glass of Doctor's. It started as a low throb, a rhythmic pounding that she felt in her molars before she heard it with her ears. Thwup, 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 thwup. The sound of heavy air being beaten into submission. Sarah froze. Her heart rate didn't spike, it steadied. She knew that sound. It was the lullaby of the extraction point. It was the sound of salvation. It was the sound of absolute chaos. It was a sound she hadn't heard since the extraction point in the Korangal Valley 3 lifetimes ago. The clouds above the parking lot seemed to tear open. A dark shape descended, massive and menacing, tearing through the gray sky like a prehistoric predator. A UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter. It wasn't a civilian medical transport painted in friendly white and blue. It was painted matte black, void of markings except for a faint gray tail number that was barely visible against the fuselage. It banked aggressively, ignoring every FAA regulation regarding urban airspace and hospital quiet zones. The pilot flared the machine for a landing right in the center of the physician's reserved parking lot, directly on top of Dr. Thorne's painted name. The downwash was violent. It ripped the leaves off the decorative hedges, sending a green blizzard swirling through the air. It sent plastic trash cans tumbling across the asphalt, spilling their contents. Car alarms began to scream in protest, a chorus of electronic wails joining the mechanical roar of the turbine engines. Inside the hospital lobby, faces pressed against the glass. Nurses, patients, receptionists, they all stared, mouths agape. Even Dr. Thorne had run from his office to the lobby, standing behind the automatic doors, looking small and terrified as the wind rattled the glass panes. The helicopter's wheels hadn't even settled on the asphalt before the side door slid open. Two figures in full tactical gear leaped out. They moved with a fluidity that defied the weight of their plate carriers and weapons. They held short-barreled rifles low, scanning the perimeter, treating the hospital parking lot like a hot landing zone in hostile territory. Between them was a man in a flight suit, a major by the oak leaves on his collar. He sprinted through the rotor wash, ducking his head against the wind, moving as if the devil were snapping at his heels. A hapless hospital security guard, Paul, a man whose biggest daily conflict was writing tickets for expired meters, stumbled out into the rain, waving his arms. His yellow raincoat flapped wildly. "Hey, you can't land here. This is private prop." The major didn't even slow down. He moved past the guard like water around a stone, a stiff arm brushing the man aside without malice, just efficiency. The major's eyes scanned the lot with predatory intensity. "Clear the perimeter," he roared, his voice cutting through the mechanical scream of the engines. His eyes locked onto Sarah. For a second, time suspended. The rain seemed to stop. The noise faded to a dull hum. The major stopped 5 feet from her, rain dripping from the brim of his tactical cap. He was out of breath, his chest heaving. His face was pale beneath the tan of his skin, his eyes wide with a desperation that soldiers rarely showed to civilians. He looked at her, not at the nurse in the wet-stained scrubs, but at the soldier beneath. He saw the stance. He saw the stillness. "Ghost!" he shouted, using a call sign that hadn't been spoken aloud in 3 years. "We need you now." Sarah felt the world tilt on its axis. The name hit her harder than the rain. "Major Reynolds, what are you doing here? I'm a civilian now. I'm out. I don't do this anymore." Aris Thorne's office, a relentless gray rhythm that seemed to mock the silence inside the room. It was not a peaceful silence. It was a cold, sterilized vacuum, the heavy, pressurized stillness that usually follows the announcement of a time of death. The room smelled faintly of lemon furniture polish and the stale, bitter aroma of coffee that had sat on a warmer for too long. "It's Vance!" Reynolds shouted, stepping closer, invading her personal space, ignoring the chaos of the alarms and the rotor wash. "Commander Vance." His team was hit. Ambush in the Sahel. They're extracting him to a black site 20 minutes out. Sarah felt a cold hand grip her heart. Silas Vance, the man she had dragged 3 miles through a sandstorm with a bullet in her own leg. The man who had sat by her hospital bed for a week when she finally rotated home. The man who had sworn he owed her a life. "What's the injury?" Sarah asked, the nurse vanishing, the medic taking over. Her voice was suddenly steel, cutting through the noise. "Shrapnel in the pericardium," Reynolds yelled, wiping rain from his eyes. "He's got a fragment sitting right on top of the right ventricle. He's refusing to let the base surgeons touch him. He's holding a live grenade, Sarah. He's got the pin pulled halfway out, and he is swearing to God he'll blow the whole med bay if anyone but Ghost Miller opens his chest." "He's an idiot," Sarah hissed, but her mind was already racing. Pericardial intrusion, tamponade risk. "Is he stable?" "Negative," Reynolds yelled, grabbing her arm. His grip was bruising. "He's fading. BP is tanking. He bought us time by demanding you, but he's running out of currency. We have the birds hot. We have clearance from the Joint Chiefs. We just need the hands. Sarah looked at Reynolds. She looked at the Black Hawk, the rotors spinning a deadly halo in the rain. Then she looked back at the hospital. Through the glass doors, she saw Dr. Thorne. He was staring, his face pressed against the glass, looking at the woman he had just fired. He looked like a fish in an aquarium, small, contained, safe. She looked down at the wet pavement where her messenger bag lay. Inside was her lunch, her car keys, her civilian life. "Let's go," she said. She dropped the bag. She didn't look at it. She turned and ran. Sarah Miller, the fired nurse, sprinted toward the waiting war machine. The two tactical operators fell in beside her, shielding her body with theirs as if they were under fire. Reynolds boosted her into the cabin. She strapped in, the familiar click of the 4-point harness feeling more like a hug than a restraint. It felt more like home than her apartment ever had. The crew chief handed her a headset. She slid it on, the heavy ear cups drowning out the world, replacing the roar of the wind with the crackle of encrypted comms. As the Black Hawk lifted, the G-force pressing her into the seat, Sarah looked down. Through the rain-streaked window, the hospital shrank. St. Jude's Metropolitan became a toy set. Thorne was just a speck, a paper pusher in a world of Alma of iron and blood. ETA to black site, 12 minutes, P. The pilot's voice crackled in her ear. "We are running hot. Get your head in the game, Ghost." Sarah closed her eyes. She breathed in the smell of the cabin, hydraulic fluid, sweat, and gun oil. She wasn't in the parking lot anymore. She wasn't in the HR office. She was back in the mindset. The checklist scrolled behind her eyelids. Airway, breathing, circulation, bleeding. The helicopter banked hard, flying low over the city traffic, a dark angel of mercy cutting through the skyline. Inside the cabin, Reynolds handed her a ruggedized tablet. "Vitals are streaming from the transport bird. Look at this mess." Sarah took the tablet. Her hands were steady. She studied the screen. The heart rate was erratic, a jagged line of chaos. Blood pressure was dropping, 80/50. Oxygen saturation was slipping. "He has a tamponade," she muttered, her fingers tracing the waveform. "Fluid is building up around the heart sac. It's squeezing the muscle. The heart can't fill with blood between beats." But nobody had died today. That was the irony that tasted like copper in Sarah Miller's mouth. In fact, a 4-year-old boy named Leo was currently breathing in the pediatric ICU, his small chest rising and falling in a rhythmic testament to life, solely because Nurse Sarah Miller had decided that a heartbeat was more important than a signature on a consent form. "Doctor, if we don't drain that pressure in the next 10 minutes, his heart stops and it won't start again." "The base doctors wanted to crack his chest open," Reynolds said over the comms, his voice tight. "Vance told them they'd kill him. He said you have a technique. A subsophoid approach you used in Kandahar." "I don't have a technique," Sarah said, checking the trauma kit strapped to the wall of the fuselage. She began pulling out supplies, verifying expiration dates, checking seals. "I just don't hesitate, and I know Vance's anatomy better than they do." The landing at the Black Site, a repurposed airfield on the industrial outskirts of the city, usually used for cargo, was rough. The pilot slammed the bird onto the tarmac, the wheels screeching. Sarah was unbuckling before the motion stopped. The side doors slid open to reveal a hangar buzzing with activity. Floodlights turned the rainy afternoon into a blinding white stage. In the center, surrounded by terrified-looking support staff and a team of baffled military surgeons, was a gurney. Sarah sprinted. She didn't run like a civilian jogger. She ran low, balanced, knees bent, ready for impact. She hit the ground running and didn't slow down until she reached the gurney. Silas Vance looked like death. His skin was gray, sweating profusely, the sweat beating on his forehead like cold dew. A massive pressure bandage covered his chest, soaked through with bright red arterial blood. His hand was clenched white around a grenade, his thumb holding the spoon down. His eyes were open. They drifted, unfocused, rolling slightly in his head. Then they landed on her face. A spark of recognition fought through the shock. Took your time, Ghost, he wheezed. A bloody froth bubbled on his lips. His voice was a wet rattle. Shut up, Silas, Sarah said. Her voice was not the soft, comforting voice of Nurse Miller. It was a command. Give the grenade to Reynolds. Now! Vance's eyes locked on hers. He trusted her more than God. Slowly, his hand relaxed. Reynolds stepped in, gently took the explosive, and pinned it, moving it away with the care of a bomb disposal expert. Sarah ripped open a sterile pack. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't wait for a doctor to invite her in. She turned to the stunned medical team standing around the gurney. I need a 16-gauge pericardial needle, a 50cc syringe, and ultrasound guidance. Now! She screamed. The authority in her voice hit them like a physical shockwave. These men were soldiers, accustomed to chains of command, but they recognized a superior predator when they saw one. They scrambled. A pompous-looking colonel, clearly the base surgeon, stepped forward. He was clean, his scrubs pressed. He looked like Dr. Thorne in camouflage. Now wait a minute. You are a civilian. You have no jurisdiction here. You cannot operate on a high-value target without my written... Sarah didn't even look at him. She grabbed the ultrasound probe, squirted gel onto Vance's chest, and slapped the probe down. Colonel, his systolic is 60 and dropping, she said, staring at the monitor. If you want to argue about my credentials, you can explain to the Joint Chiefs why their best commander died on your floor while you were quoting the handbook. Or you can shut up and hold this damn probe so I can see the heart. The colonel froze, his face flushing red. He opened his mouth, looked at Vance, looked at the deadly seriousness in Sarah's eyes, and closed his mouth. He stepped forward and held the probe. Sarah worked. The world narrowed down to a 3-inch square on Vance's chest. It was a dance she knew too well. She watched the screen. Thorne, the chief of medicine at St. Jude's Metropolitan, did not see it that way. To him, the hospital was not a place of healing. It was a fortress of bureaucracy, a cathedral of liability where the prayer book was the policy manual. He sat behind his mahogany desk, a slab of dark wood so polished it reflected his dour expression like a black mirror. There it was, the black void surrounding the heart muscle. The fluid was crushing the organ, strangling it. She took the long needle. There was no room for error. The margin was millimeters. A millimeter too deep, she punctures the heart muscle and kills him instantly. A millimeter too shallow, nothing happens, and he dies slowly. She didn't shake. Her hands, which had trembled slightly when Dr. Thorne fired her, were now rock steady. She found the angle, just below the rib cage, aiming up towards the left shoulder. She inserted the needle. She pushed through the skin, through the subcutaneous fat, through the muscle. Pop. She felt the subtle give of the fascia, the distinctive tactile sensation of penetrating the pericardial sac. It was a feeling you couldn't learn in a textbook. You had to feel it to know it. She pulled back on the plunger of the syringe. Dark, non-clotting blood filled the chamber, the old blood that had been compressing the heart. On the monitor, the jagged, dying rhythm suddenly smoothed out. The frantic, thready beep was replaced by a stronger, deeper sound. Beep, beep, beep. Strong, steady, regular. Vance took a massive, gasping breath, his back arching off the gurney as his lungs finally had room to expand. His eyes widened as the pressure released, the gray pallor of his skin flushing with oxygen. "Got him!" Reynolds whispered from behind her. He sounded like he was praying. Holy hell, she got him! Sarah didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. She secured the catheter, taping it down with rapid, efficient movements. "He's not out of the woods," she said, her voice flat. "That drained the pressure, but he's still bleeding internally. He needs the OR. He needs a thoracotomy, but he'll live to get there." She stepped back, stripping off her bloodied gloves. They made a wet snapping sound. The adrenaline began to fade, leaving her knees feeling like water. She looked around. The hangar was silent. The only sound was the steady beep of the monitor and the rain hammering on the tin roof. The colonel, the support staff, the flight crew, they were all staring at her. Not with the disdain of the hospital nurses. Not with the judgment of Dr. Thorne. They looked at her with awe. They looked at her like she was a weapon of mass salvation. Sarah leaned against the gurney, wiping sweat from her forehead with her forearm. She looked at Vance. He was unconscious now, sedated but alive. "You owe me a drink, Silas," she whispered. 3 days later, the rain had finally stopped. The sky over the city was a brilliant scrubbed blue. St. Jude's Metropolitan was humming along, business as usual. The floor waxers were buffing the linoleum, the coffee carts were making their rounds, and the PA system was paging doctors to extensions they would never answer. Dr. Thorne was in the middle of a lecture to a group of terrified interns in the main auditorium. He was pontificating about the importance of hierarchy, about how the chain of command was the immune system of the hospital. "You must understand," Thorne said, pacing the stage, "that without order, we have chaos, and in chaos, patients die." His secretary, Brenda, burst into the room. She didn't knock. She didn't wait for a pause. She looked terrified, her face pale. "Dr. Thorne," she squeaked. "You need to come to the lobby. Now." Thorne frowned, adjusting his glasses. "I am teaching, Brenda. Unless the building is on fire, it can wait." "Sir," Brenda said, her voice trembling, "it's the general. General Harris. He says he's not leaving until he sees the man who fired Captain Miller." Thorne paled. The chalk in his hand snapped. "Captain Miller? Who is Captain Miller?" He slid a single sheet of paper across the surface. The sound of the paper friction against the wood was like a hiss, a serpent striking in slow motion. Thorne didn't look at her immediately. He was busy arranging his desk accessories, a crystal paperweight, a gold-plated pen set, a framed photo of a sailboat he likely never sailed, into a perfect geometric alignment. "We don't employ a Captain Miller." "He means Sarah," Brenda whispered. "The nurse you fired." Thorne walked to the lobby. His steps were slow, heavy. He felt a sense of dread pooling in his stomach. The sight in the lobby stopped him dead. Standing in the center of the atrium, blocking the flow of patients and visitors, was General Harris. He was a 3-star legend, a man whose face had been on the cover of Time magazine. He was flanked by 2 military police officers standing at parade rest. And beside him, standing tall and proud, was Sarah. She wasn't wearing scrubs. She wasn't wearing the stained uniform of a subordinate. She was wearing a dress blue uniform that fit her perfectly. Rows of ribbons decorated her chest. Ribbons for valor, for service, for campaigns Thorne had only read about in the newspaper. Silver wings gleamed on her collar. She wasn't looking at the floor. She wasn't hiding. She was looking straight at Thorne. Her eyes were clear, sharp, and utterly unafraid. Thorne approached, his knees weak. The silence in the lobby was absolute. Every nurse, every receptionist, every patient was watching. "General," Thorne stammered, smoothing his tie, I believe there has been a misunderstanding. Ms. Miller was terminated for cause. She broke protocol. She put the hospital at risk." General Harris looked down at the doctor. He looked at Thorne as if he were a smudge of dirt on a polished boot. "Dr. Thorne," Harris rumbled. His voice carried to the back of the room without shouting. "The protocols you cling to are designed to protect your insurance rates. The protocols Captain Miller follows are designed to protect human life. We just came to return her badge." The general reached into his pocket. He pulled out the plastic ID card Sarah had left on the mahogany desk 3 days ago. He held it up, letting the light catch the plastic. Then, with a casual flick of his wrist, he dropped it into the trash can next to the reception desk. It landed with a hollow clatter. "She won't be needing that," the general said. "She's been reinstated to active duty. She's taking over the trauma training command for the Eastern Seaboard. She's going to teach doctors, real doctors, how to actually save lives when the manual fails. We just thought you should know what kind of talent you threw away." Sarah stepped forward. The sound of her polished shoes on the tile was sharp. She looked at her former colleagues peeking out from behind the reception desk. She saw Jessica. She saw Brenda. They looked small. They looked ashamed. Then she looked at Thorne. She saw the man who valued signatures over heartbeats. "It wasn't arrogance, Doctor," Sarah said. Her voice was calm, echoing in the silent lobby, filling the space. "It was experience. You saw a nurse breaking a rule. I saw a boy dying. If you can't tell the difference, you shouldn't be wearing that white coat." She didn't wait for a response. There was nothing left to say. She turned and walked out the front doors, flanking the general. The automatic doors slid open, letting in the bright, warm sunlight. She walked into the light, leaving the cold, sterile world of St. Jude's behind her. She didn't look back. There was no need. The silence she left behind was loud enough to shatter glass. Finally, he looked at the smudge of betadine on her scrub top. His nose wrinkled in distaste, a micro-expression of revulsion that Sarah caught instantly. To him, the brownish-orange stain wasn't a badge of hard work or evidence of a life saved. It was a sign of disorder. And in Thorne's hospital, disorder was a sin far greater than malpractice. "You have no right to bypass procedure, Ms. Miller," Thorne snapped. His voice was tight and clipped, sharp as surgical scissors cutting through gauze. He finally raised his eyes, cold and gray, devoid of any warmth or humanity. They were the eyes of an actuary, not a healer. "We are an institution of laws, not a cowboy outfit. You utilized a reserve emergency kit without an attending physician's verbal authorization.